All right, so welcome to the September issue edition of the Atlanta Radio Club monthly meeting, first Thursday of the month. This is my first one, my first meeting having running a meeting in a long, long time, so I'm a little out of practice. We don't really have any pressing business, though I would ask the people on the meeting to hang on after the presentation, and the board would like to make a few comments. I'd like to make a few comments, and I see most of the people here, so we can actually get some other things in. I see Arnold as well. He is a rare contact for us. Rob, why don't you take it over, introduce the speaker, and let's hear about antique radios. Did we lose Rob? Rob.
I think I'm back. Yeah, before we do that, Bill, well, I guess we don't see Stephen out there with the repeater report. So okay. Yeah, I want to announce our speaker. We have a great speaker this month again, Stuart Smolkin, WA5EYI, and he's from the Asheville Radio Museum. And I think we talked about that. John, I think we were talking about actually arranging a trip up there. So now we're going to get a tour of it, which may make us want to go more. It may give us more of a reason to go. I think that you spoke to the Fayetteville Club a couple of weeks ago, I think, Stuart, and I heard from them, and they thought it was a great presentation, which didn't surprise me. So I'm sure we're going to get another one like that tonight. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Stuart. Go ahead, Stuart. Hi.
Hi. Are you guys seeing me, or do I need to turn on my video or something?
Bill? What do you want?
Well, I see. Yeah, if he's got video to run, what I see is a little box that has his name in it.
Yeah, I'm not sure why you're not seeing my picture. I'm not much of an expert on Zoom.
I'm not either. John, Rob, any ideas?
You got the start on the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
Stuart, this you got start video going. There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Good.
There we go.
Adjust myself. As you can see, I'm at home. I'm not at the museum, but what I'll be doing is giving you a virtual tour using a slideshow presentation that I've prepared. It's great to hear that you're thinking about paying a visit to the Asheville Radio Museum. Are you guys able to respond back to me as I'm talking? Because I'd like to make this interactive if I can. I'm wondering if any of you have ever been to the Asheville Radio Museum.
I have not, and I feel kind of bad because I used to live in Asheville.
Okay. Well, it is changed quite a bit since when you might have visited. I've been associated with the museum about 5 or 6 years or so. But believe it or not, this museum has been around in Asheville since the year 2001. So we're actually having our 22nd anniversary this year. Anyway, the museum has evolved quite a bit over the years, and I'll explain a little bit tonight about the museum and how it came into existence. And most of what I'll be doing is trying to show you some of the things that you can see if you're able to visit the museum in Asheville itself. And if not, I'll give you a couple of other ways that you can visit the museum virtually. So I'll just to set expectations, I'm going to show you the ham radio equipment that we have, but my focus tonight is not going to be on the ham radio side of the museum. There are a whole lot of other exhibits that I think you'll find interesting. I know the folks in Fayetteville did last week. So with that, I'll go ahead and launch the presentation. Let me ask you though, how long would you like me to run this? Do you have a particular time frame in mind? Because I'll fit myself to it.
45 minutes to an hour would be a good fit.
Okay.
It's up to you.
Okay. When I did the presentation last week, it did run for an hour. But if you find it's running too long for your purposes, just give me the high sign and I'll wrap it up. But hopefully you'll find it interesting. And here we go. Also, I'll say, if you want to ask questions at any time, please do so. And you can just interrupt me even if I'm speaking. It's a lot easier actually giving these presentations if it's more of a two-way thing than just me talking to you guys for an hour. So anyway, let me see if I can bring up the presentation and we'll get started. Okay, are you guys seeing what looks like a view into the museum right now?
Yep.
We are.
Okay, great. Well, at least the technology is working so far. As you can see, we are a small but mighty museum. We have lots of things on display, all the way up to the ceiling right now. And I could use more room, but this is what the school gives us, and we're grateful to have it. So, okay, trying to advance the slide, and that's not happening. Here we go. Let me tell you just briefly how this museum came to be. Has anybody heard of a guy named Carl Smith, N4AA? Does that ring any bells? Carl lives or lived in Asheville. He passed away a couple years ago. But Carl was the editor of DXing magazine publication. And so one day he had a birthday, and he's an amateur extra, and so is his wife. And his wife handed him an antique radio for his birthday. And he said, "Thank you, dear." And she said, "Well, now why don't you start a museum?" So he took the suggestion to heart, and he got together with a few other ham friends of his, one of which was an instructor, or one of whom rather was an instructor at the local community college here in Asheville. And there was an empty room there. It was actually just a storage room. But he approached the school and said, "Would it be possible for us to set up a radio museum in that empty room?" And they considered it, and they wrote him a letter back, said, "We'll let you have it for a year and see how it goes." And so here we are 22 years later, and it seems to be going pretty well. So we're happy to say we're still around. I thought what I'd do is show you a very brief video about the museum. Any of you guys ever watch a program called, well, you're in Georgia, you probably don't get it. Up here in North Carolina, there's a PBS show called North Carolina Weekend, and they focus on things to see and do around the state in their shows. And what I'd like to show you is about a 4-minute video they did on the Asheville Radio Museum. So here we go.
Radio wave is something we take for granted, and it's not the simplest concept to understand. Thanks to the Asheville Radio Museum, we're taught the wonders of this late 19th century discovery.
A radio wave can actually travel at 186,000 miles per second. Radio waves enable the kind of mass communication that allows people in one place and in a far distant place to have a connection, an immediate connection that before radio simply wasn't possible.
In 1877, Heinrich Hertz, a German scientist, proved that radio waves exist, and it all started with an electrical spark.
In the early days of radio, it was not possible to send music or speech over the radio. All you could do is create sparks. And the spark actually generates a radio wave. So if I turn on this radio here, every time I press the telegraph key, it creates sparks, and the sparks can be used to send Morse code messages.
In the early 1900s, the triode vacuum tube was invented. This technology was used to send wireless voice and music transmissions, which eventually launched radio broadcasting in the 1920s. Radio suddenly brought people together, sometimes during tragic events.
This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flames crashing to the ground.
The Asheville Radio Museum is both a teaching organization and a repository for various artifacts from the history of radio. We started off with about 20 or 30 radios, and that snowballed. So there's one side that's devoted to the history of amateur radio.
This is Whiskey 4, America, Foxtrot, Mike.
And on the other side is the broadcast radio and development of radio and electronics. The museum is located in Asheville Buncombe Technical College, and in particular, we're in the department of sciences.
I find that the majority of people learn more
by putting their hands on it than they do all the theory on the board all day long. Once they do it, then it changes everything.
So Rose, this is our early 1900s Morse code practice machine that people would use to build up their speed. Let's see how it works.
It's safe to say there's something for everyone at the Asheville Radio Museum.
Places like this are important because they help remind kids of history and where we came from. And for me personally, it exposed me to a whole new hobby and an area that I didn't really know existed that's perfect for me.
A place to see the kind of history and that has built the technology that we have today. And it's not something that's very easy to see because there aren't very many of these collections in the whole country. I'd say our job here with visitors is to amaze, fascinate, and educate. And that's what we attempt to do, whether they like radio or not.
The Asheville Radio Museum is at 315 Elm Building on the campus of Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College, and they're open every Friday from 1 to 3, February through November, and by appointment. For more information, visit their website at avlradiomuseum.org.
So there you are. That video was created about 3 or 4 years ago by the North Carolina Weekend Show. And it's really been great for us because this is a museum that's small. It's on a college campus, and really most people were not even aware of it, even in Asheville. But now that we're getting exposure on this statewide TV station, it really has given us a higher profile. We're getting a lot more visitors coming in, which we always enjoy. There's another story out here. These are all on our website. I'm not going to play this for you, but this was done on National Public Radio a couple years ago. So the museum, we are a teaching museum. I think that's one of the things that sets us apart from other museums, which are just a place to look at radio equipment. We concentrate on these 4 areas. Farm radio is important, especially it was important up here in rural Western North Carolina, where there were lots of farmers back in the early 1900s, and of course farmers today. And then we have a broad array of radios used in the homes. And for people that are interested, we take them all the way through the technology, starting with crystal radios and regenerative and up through TRF and superhead and so forth. We have an entire wall, essentially, of amateur radio equipment. You'll see some pictures of that in a minute. And then we also focus on the technology. One of the exciting things for us is helping people to understand how important radio waves are and how unique and interesting they are compared to sound waves. By the way, I wanted to ask, do any of you guys actually have an interest in vintage radio equipment, home equipment, in addition to your amateur radio hobby?
Well, I do have a few older radios around that still work. I don't know if you'd classify that as an interest or not, but a couple of old shortwave radios from back in the 30s and 40s. Okay.
Well, that is good, and you'll see some of those in what we go through as well. We have a couple of shelves that are dedicated to shortwave radios. In particular, I just got some very interesting verified reception cards in last week from a lady whose brother had passed away. And back in, I guess, the 1960s, he used to listen to shortwave radio a lot, as I did. And he had some interesting verified reception cards from Radio Australia and Radio Czechoslovakia and Radio Moscow and a few others. So anyway, I hope you enjoy seeing the vintage radios that are in here. Maybe it'll even get some of you interested in expanding your hobby in that direction. So as mentioned, we're a teaching museum. As I said at the end of that video, we try to amaze, educate, and fascinate. And I say that because we have some number of visitors that have a drug problem. And what I mean is they were drugged to the museum by their spouse, and they're not particularly interested in radios themselves. But by the time they leave, they're very happy and excited they were there, and they think they had an interesting time. So hopefully you'll feel the same after we finish this presentation. One of the things that's a challenge with young folks, because we are in a community college, and we sometimes give tours to students in their classes, is getting them to think about how important radio technology is in our lives today. So sometimes when the classes come in, I give them this pop quiz that you see on your screen. And what I ask them is which of these modern conveniences do not depend on radio waves? So you can scan down the list. And of course, it's a bogus quiz because every single one of these things depends on radio waves. But the idea is try and get the students interested. And then once you have them interested, you have their attention. And once you have their attention, then they're more inclined to stay with you and learn a few things. I will say this, we're very proud of the response we get from visitors to the museum. And it may seem strange to you guys, but most of the visitors that we get these days are not hams. In fact, it's somewhat surprising to me that we don't get more hams coming to the museum, and I can't explain why. But we get lots of visitors that just come to Asheville, and they usually do a query saying museums around me, and we'll get a lot of them showing up at the museum. And we have 50 reviews out there on the internet now. It's hard to get reviews because most people don't take the time to go online and do them. But all 50 of our reviews are 5-star reviews. And so I hope you take that as some encouragement that if you can come up, you'll enjoy your tour as well. So the museum is organized essentially into these 3 sections. We have an entire wall basically of amateur radio equipment, and you'll see some photos of that in a minute. What I enjoy a lot is the teaching section where we help people understand how these invisible radio waves were discovered and how the technology was developed. And then we've got a very interesting display, I think, of how home radios have developed over the years, from crystal to super hits. And it's always interesting to see the reaction of women that come into the museum, because the first thing that strikes them is the beauty of these old radios. And you've probably seen some yourselves, but when they made them in the mahogany cabinets and they made them in the walnut cabinets with the beautiful styling, it's something that people can appreciate even today. So the ham radio wall, I'm going to flip through this fairly quickly. I just want to give you a sense of what we have. You can see the early equipment there on the left that was home built. In the next section, these 2 are interesting. These were built by a professor at Louisiana State University who's a ham, and he wanted to see what it was like to build equipment like the poor hams were using back in the 30s and 40s. So he found some plans, I think, on QST magazine and built this equipment. But it was very kind of him to donate it to the museum. So we've got Collins, we've got Hammerland, we've got Hallicrafters, we've got Heathkit, we've got just about everything you can imagine on display. And like I say, I won't spend a lot of time on any of these individually tonight, but if you come to the museum, you can bring back memories of the equipment you used to operate or the equipment you lusted after but you couldn't afford. Speaking of which, when I was a teenager, what I lusted after was this Collins S-line rig that you see right here. And I couldn't afford it, but my high school sweetheart was the daughter of a doctor. And of course, doctors could afford these things. So he would come home late at night after seeing patients all day and doing his rounds at the hospital and have his dinner by himself because the family had already eaten. And then he'd go take a shower and put on his robe and head right to his ham shack, which was right in the corner of the den. And that was how he'd unwind, is getting on his S line. So I'm glad to have it. Maybe one day we'll see if we can get this one working. I'm not sure if it is or not. This is the DXCC Century Club certificate. You might recognize this thing. What I find interesting about it is that the person had 352 verified contacts with 352 different countries, which was quite an achievement. I don't think there even are that many countries you can contact today, but you probably know better than me. This radio in the front, has anybody ever heard of a breadboard radio? Breadboard radios were made back in the 1920s by a guy named Atwater Kent. And he thought his components were so beautiful that he thought people would want to see them. So he didn't put them in a cabinet, at least not through the mid-1920s. So he found out very quickly he was wrong, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. So radio discovery and development. It's hard to take pictures in here without a wide angle lens, but You can see things here. There's a spark transmitter here we use to show, as I did in the video, how sparks can create radio waves. This is an interesting device we'll look at in a little bit. It's an early 1900 Morse code recorder, and there's a vacuum tube display on here. It's kind of chopped off on here, but anyway, it's always interesting teaching people about how wonderful radio waves are, and we do that on this side of the museum. And then over here, and you can see how crowded it is. We're just stacked to the ceiling, but we have lots of signs explaining everything. And it's interesting to see how radio technology developed over the years. Anyway, I hope you're able to put together a trip to the museum sometime. And if you do, then you can do it at a time that's convenient to you. In other words, we'd open up on a time that's not a regular opening time if you have a group coming up. But if you're not able to, there are several ways of doing the virtual visits to the museum. One, of course, is this presentation tonight, but also we have a lot of good information on our website, which is avlradiomuseum.org, AVL being the abbreviation for our airport, just like your ATL, but avlradiomuseum.org. We'll look at a few things on that in just a minute. We also have a smartphone tour. A couple of years ago, we put this together. So we took about 24 of the interesting things we had on display back then, and we made a tour that you can access using your smartphone. You download a free app called UniGuide, and it brings up a menu of what those things are, and then you can pick off whatever you want to hear about. And you can do this from your home or anywhere. You don't have to be in the museum. And then lastly, on the website, there are lots of stories that you can read or watch about the museum. And these are on our website, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a second. So that's the homepage of our website, or at least a part of it. And so what you'll see is that we're normally open between 1 and 3 on Saturdays. We shut down in December and January. The next link shows what's new, and you'll see a lot of interesting things there. And there's also at the top, you can't see it on your screen probably, but there's a topics menu. And if you click on that topics menu, it brings up all these subsections that are on the website with all the good information under each one of these, actually. If you'd like to have a copy of the museum flyer, of course, we have these at the museum and also at the interstate welcome centers if you're coming up into North Carolina. But if you'd like to download a copy just to peruse it, this is also available for download on our website. So these are the 3 main sections on the website. So as mentioned, we have one that talks about radio wave discovery and development. And we have this out there because we like to have information that's useful to students. And so it's very gratifying that every couple of times a year, I receive a nice email from a teacher saying how useful the information was on the website and how much their students enjoyed being able to see so much good information all in one place with all the links they need to have. There's a section, of course, on amateur radio and a section on vintage home radio with a focus in there on also on farm radio and our local radio station history here in Asheville. On the one of the topics on there is also on radio for farmers. And so we have collected a lot of articles from the early 1920s talking about how important radio was to farmers when it came out. Can any of you think of any reasons why having a radio would be useful to a farmer? You shout them out if you do.
Crop prices.
Exactly.
Weather.
All good answers. With a radio, you could hopefully get a weather report far enough in advance that if there's a storm that would threaten your crop or your livestock, you'd have time to try and bring it in. And prices, there were daily price reports on the radio. So if you lived near a railhead, you could hopefully try and bring your crop or your livestock stock to market at the railhead when the prices were highest. And then thirdly, the United States Department of Commerce started a program which was called College for Seniors, is the name I call it by. But it's weekly broadcasts that taught farmers how to get more crop yields by using fertilizer, or how to prevent their animals from getting sick or treat them if they were sick. And also there was entertainment and information for the women folk as well. So very useful information for a person to have if they were a farmer. So this just quickly, I won't dwell on this, but this is some of the section on how radio was discovered and developed. Just brief information on some of the important folks that were involved. One thing that you might find interesting, we have 3 different albums out on the website. One of them is an album of early 1900 amateur radio stations. So what you're seeing there is 2 of those stations, and I think there's about 15 of them that are in the slideshow. Somebody years before I joined the museum had come in with a paper copy of this photo album, and it's really pretty interesting to look at, see what the old stations look like. And so we have the paper album at the museum that you can flip through, or if you're online, you can flip through the entire album that we digitized that's out there. We also have a slideshow or photo album, if you will, called The Beauty of Radio Equipment. And as I mentioned, a lot of visitors are really struck by how beautiful some of the old equipment can be. And then lastly, there's a collection of how beautiful vintage radio dials, because these things in themselves are a work of art in many cases. Okay, so if you're not able to make it to Asheville, as I mentioned, there is a free audio tour on your smartphone. And so on our website are the instructions for how you would download the free Uniguide app and then access the slideshow for the museum. And this Uniguide app has actually become quite popular. I think there's probably, I'm going to say 16 or 18 tours in Asheville that you can access with the Uniguide app, in addition to the Radio Museum tour. And you can also access tours in other cities. So it's interesting just to look around and see what they have. Okay, so the bulk of the rest of the presentation is going to be on interesting things to see. And so again, this is not focused on amateur radio equipment. It's more focused on other things that other hams that have visited the museum find interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this as well. So this is the antique Morse code practice machine that you saw in the video presentation earlier. It is called an omnigraph, OMNIGRAPH. It came out in the early 1900s. And so the power was provided by the clockwork mechanism you see on the right-hand side with the knob above it. And then the Morse code is the bumps on the silver wheel that's sitting to the left. And it looks like it's a solid wheel, but it's actually individual wheels that are only about 1/8 of an inch in thickness. And so this is a stack of those wheels. And I'm not quite sure why they did that, except for the fact that I think you can custom order wheels that were more to your particular interest. And also, if you're giving somebody a Morse code test, then you could change the order of the wheels in the stack. So if they tried to memorize it, that wouldn't work. Now there's a speed regulator on here, right here. So you can adjust whether the Morse code is being played quickly or slowly. So you start out slowly, and then as you build up your speed, you can increase the speed and continue to practice. Morse code recorder. Again, this thing is over 100 years old. I think it was in the early 1905, 1910 range. And this came out of the estate of a former newspaper editor here in Asheville. And it was up in his man cave, and it was next to an old 1930s movie projector. So his granddaughter just assumed it was movie equipment. But when I looked at it and I saw the electromagnet here, I said, no, that's not movie equipment. Anyway, the way it works is you've got this roll of paper tape up here, and over here you've got a pulley that attaches to a motor, and there's 2 connections on the back for wired telegraph wires. So when an electrical dot or dash comes in, it activates the electromagnet, and there's a seesaw arm running here. So when this end of the arm pulls down, this end goes up, and it presses the moving paper tape against this ink roller, and records a short smudge for a dot or a long smudge for a dash. So if the code is coming in too quickly for someone to translate, they can later pick up the paper tape off the floor and do it at their leisure, or if they're out of the room, they can come, when they come back, they'll find the paper tape. So interestingly, and I know you can't see it in here, but this is a brass case and there's an engraved logo here, and it says Makanska Etabel Evald Anderson and Company, Copenhagen. And so that's how we figured out what it was. And this is actually on the internet, pictured in a book digitized, I think by Amazon, of early Danish scientific instruments. So great addition for the museum. Have any of you ever seen this type of recorder before?
I haven't.
They're pretty rare. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen one show up on eBay. So we were very fortunate to be able to get our hands on it. Now, it turns out in the 1920s, there was actually a company here in Asheville that briefly was making radios to sell. It was called the High Grade Wireless Instrument Company, and this is a radio that they made. There are only 2 of these that are still in existence. This one has been restored. It was donated by a gent up here in North Carolina whose name is Robert Lozier. Robert is one of the experts who belongs to the Antique Wireless Association. I don't think there's anything that he cannot do. But anyway, we are very grateful for his donation of this radio to have it on display. It is the better of the two that are known to exist. Being the curator, I always hope that somebody's going to call me one day about an old radio they found in the attic here in Asheville, but so far it hadn't happened. Not this one anyway. 1949 television set. Some of you may be old enough as I am to remember looking at a TV set this size. But anyway, this is one of the things that visitors find so fascinating, because everybody these days is used to looking at the big screen TVs. And so when they see this little 7-inch diagonal screen and see how fuzzy and lacking contrast it is, they have a hard time believing the whole family would gather around this and watch it. But we explained that's how things got started. Now, one thing you may have noticed on TV sets, and I don't know if you can see it in this illustration, but there's a channel 2, but there's not a channel 1. So does anybody know what happened to channel 1?
Wasn't it used up by either 6-meter radio or radar?
Well, you're close. I think when it was originally assigned, it was assigned, I believe, to television when television came out, and then the FCC decided it had to do a reorganization of frequency assignments. And one of the things that needed frequencies was mobile radio. So they took away those frequencies for channel 1 TV and gave it to mobile. So the TV manufacturers decided it was easier just to eliminate channel 1 and leave everything else the same than try and renumber everything, starting with 1 again. So anyway, that's the story. Has anyone ever heard of a Zenith Stratosphere radio? That's what you're seeing in the picture here.
My grandfather had one in his barn that belonged to his father, so it was my great grandfather's, and this is what he had. Of course, it had been sitting in a barn for 40 years when we found it.
Were you able to do anything with it?
Not really. The speaker had completely rotted out of it. The metal chassis was rusted to the point. I mean, it wasn't sitting directly in the rain, but it had been sitting basically outside for 40 or 50 years. And my little brother and I found it, and honestly, I sat down and cried when I saw the condition it was in.
I believe it.
This is when I told people that it actually ran with a battery, but somebody had put a power supply. I'm using my mouse cursor, but you can't see it. It had put a power supply in the bottom and tried to wire it up, and they missed it. And so they took a metal spoon and bent it, hooked the 2 pieces of wire together.
Oh boy.
And the spoon was still hanging there.
Well, I'm laughing, but I'm crying at the same time.
It was a beautiful radio.
Well, for those of you who are not familiar, Zenith decided to get into the high-end radio business in the middle 1930s. And so they decided they were going to build the most attractive cabinet and put the most advanced radio electronics inside. And they did. And it was called the Zenith Stratosphere. It first came out in 1935, and the one you're looking at was made in 1936. So in those days, in the middle 1930s, you could buy a car for anywhere from around $500 to $600, depending on the model. So imagine a radio that was priced at $750 more than the price of a car. So there were not that many people who could afford these things. And this was when the country was coming out of the Depression. And so there were people that had a lot of money that didn't have it anymore. So Zenith only succeeded in selling 300 of these radios. So to put that in perspective, in the 1920s, Atwater Kent was selling 1 million radios a year, and Philco over its lifetime sold 8 million radios. So we're only talking about 300 radios like this that were ever made. And there's only 50 of them that are known to exist. There's a couple of collectors that maintain a database. And so there's only 2 of these radios in United States museums. And we are so incredibly fortunate that we have this one. It has got its original coating on the or finish rather on the cabinet. The cabinet is made with 7 different veneers. There's 3 wonderful speakers inside. If you were to hear this thing, you would swear you were listening to a modern FM radio, even though it's an AM radio. It's got 25 vacuum tubes in there, 8 of them just in the amplifier section for the audio. So great radio. My only complaint was that when you have a tube go out, now you got to go through 25 tubes trying to figure out which one it is, but that's a price I'm willing to pay.
So you have a working one in Asheville?
That you're looking at it. If you were to come up here, I'd play it for you.
Okay, I will.
If I can share the quick story, as I say, I'm the curator, and I get the calls, and so you never know what people are going to offer you, and more often than not, it's just something mundane or in bad condition or whatever. But I get a call one day, and the man says, "My father passed away, and my father was an avid radio collector, and we would like to honor our father by putting his radios in a museum. Are you interested?" So I called a guy named Ron Beaver, who's president of our group and has been a ham for, I guess, 40 or 50 years, and said, "Ron, you ever heard of a Stratosphere? This guy wants to give us one." He says, "Drop everything you're doing and go get that radio." So the radio was 300 miles away on the coast of South Carolina. And when I called the guy saying, "Yes, we're interested," he told me, well, he'd heard from another vintage radio museum in Virginia that had offered to come down and pick it up. So long story short, I had to compete against that other museum to get this radio. And thankfully, we had all the right answers to what was important to this family, and we were able to get it. Thankfully, one of our members had just bought a new truck, and even more thankfully, his son lived not too far away. That he lived in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and the son had a horse trailer, and we were able to attach the horse trailer to the father's truck and drive 300 miles down to South Carolina and pick this thing up, and another 300 miles to bring it back. So we are very glad to have it, and I think you'll really enjoy seeing it if you can get up here.
I had no idea. We found this thing in 1985 when my brother, I was in college at the time.
Uh-huh.
And I really had no idea until this moment how rare it was. To us, it looked like it was the case, the wood had all sort of peeled off and the veneer was broken in it. And to us, it was just old junky radio. Now I'm sitting here and honest to God, I'm a little sick.
Yes.
Because we just left it in the barn.
I understand. I understand completely. It's one of those things that you wish you got to do over.
Yeah.
Because people have gotten them in very rough condition and brought them back. Thankfully, the chassis on these things was in beautiful condition. All the chrome is in good shape, and the cabinet veneer, we didn't have to do a thing to it. Biggest thing we're wrestling with right now is that the electrolytics have been replaced, but none of the wax paper capacitors have been. And so we're trying to decide, do we want to go all the way and take out those wax capacitors and melt them down, have the cases, then restuff them with modern capacitors? Or do we just want to go with modern capacitors? Different people have different views on it. We haven't decided yet, but we'll be thinking about it over the winter. Okay. Anybody ever heard of E.H. Scott? This is another radio we're proud to have in the museum. E.H. Scott was a guy that went into the high-end radio business before Zenith did. In fact, I think Zenith went in to compete with him. And so E.H. Scott was the first guy that actually produced a radio with the all chrome chassis and all chrome covers on the tubes and on the coil shields. So he built this radio to order. You had to place an order, and then he would build the radio for you. And again, so there are only a couple of hundred of these things sold, and we were glad to have this one. He sold these normally in beautiful cabinets. He had a whole catalog of cabinets you could choose from. And I think some of them you actually could lift off the top of the cabinet to show how beautiful the electronics are. In our case, we don't have room for another console in the museum, so we just wanted to put the guts on display. Walton, any of you guys ever heard the TV show The Waltons? Come on now.
Yeah, I used to watch it regularly.
All right. Yeah, I think a lot of us did. So last year was the 50th anniversary of the start of the Waltons TV show. And there's a big photo in the Hendersonville newspaper to promote the anniversary of the show. And it had a picture of the entire family of the Waltons, including Father Walton. And in his arms, he's holding this radio, this model radio rather. So this became known as the Walton radio. And this is another one that's highly collectible. Some of the nice things about it, first of all, it sounds great for a 1935 radio. Not as good as the Stratosphere, but a lot better than some others. But this dial is very interesting. Has anybody ever heard of what's called a shutter dial? I had not either, but this radio has a shutter dial. And what's meant by that is this is the knob here that you use to change the band. So it's got 3 bands. It's got broadcast, shortwave, and police. And so when you turn this knob, mechanically it changes the dial and brings up a dial just for the frequencies of the band you're now listening to. And so if you were to see this in action, I'm sorry I don't have a video of it, but it looks like the shutter on an old mechanical camera. So they call it a shutter dial radio. Zenith patented it. I don't think there's any other companies that have it.
I think the original radio for that is in a Walton's museum. I think it's somewhere in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken.
I'll be darned. Well, I'll have to see that sometime. Have you fellas ever heard of a tuning aid called a Magic Eye?
Yes, that was Magnavox used that amongst others. It was a green tube.
Exactly. It's hard to see here because it's reflecting here, but is a green tube. It's actually a little CRT, and so it lights up green. And if you're off station, it's not a complete circle. It looks like a pie with a piece cut out of it. And the better you tune to the station, the more that piece of pie disappears. It closes up. And so it's a very interesting tuning aid, especially for visitors to see. But again, another beautiful radio. This came from the same guy who donated the Stratosphere.
I had a radio one time that did have one of those tuning eyes, and it was really cool.
They are. Unfortunately, they don't last that long. And so nobody's making new ones. The Russians make them, I think, but I don't think you can adapt them for use over here. So when you can find them, they're scarce, and when you find them, they're generally pretty expensive. Okay, go talk a little bit about radio technology, and I hope you find it interesting as background. Have any of you ever heard of what's called reflex radio?
Is that similar to regen?
They sound the same, but they're different.
Okay.
But to your point, when radios first came out, vacuum tubes were fairly expensive. And so the question was, could you come up with a radio that didn't require a lot of vacuum tubes? So a fellow by the name of Edwin Armstrong invented and patented what was called the regenerative circuit. And I think I've got a radio like that I can show you. But essentially it was just one vacuum tube, because you would basically put the signal through that one vacuum tube and amplify it. And then you take part of the amplified signal and bring it back around and re-enter it through the vacuum tube. So it's getting amplified and re-amplified and re-amplified, 1,000 or more times. And that's how you're able to make an inexpensive radio that still had enough power to drive a loudspeaker. But a reflex radio is a radio that uses the same two vacuum tubes to amplify both the radio frequency signal and the audio signal. After the regenerative radio came out, the most popular radio was called a tuned radio frequency radio, and it had 5 tubes in it, 5 stages. So you'd have a first RF amplifier, a second RF amplifier tube, a detector tube, and then 2 audio amplifier tubes. So you had 5 tubes in there. Whereas the reflex radio, somebody figured out how to use filters and so forth to use the same 2 tubes to first amplify the RF signal and then amplify the audio signal. So this is a 1920s reflex radio, and we have a few other reflex radios as well. At the museum, as I mentioned, a lot of our visitors are not amateur radio operators. They're people that are just interested in radio in general. So one of the things that most interest our visitors is the stories that we're able to tell. So the radio you're looking at is 1930s RCA, and it was donated by a guy who lives near Asheville in a little town called Swannanoa. And he contacted me and practically begged me to put this radio in the museum. He said this radio belonged to my parents. They bought it when they first got married. It was their first piece of furniture. It was so important to them. They during World War II in the early 40s, they could listen to the chimes of Big Ben and listen to Hitler and so forth. So I took the radio from him and restored the case and restored the electronics. But more importantly, I asked him to do a brief write-up of his family story with this radio. And then we recorded him telling that story. And we have it on an MP3 player next to this radio. So when visitors come in, I play the MP3 for them, and they're fascinated just to hear the story. Have any of you guys ever heard of something called a coherer? Ring any bells?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
an iron filings detector.
You got it. You got it. So what you're seeing here is a modern reproduction of Marconi's original coherer receiver. So the coherer, as mentioned, is a glass tube with 2 electrodes and metal filings in between. So when the antenna receives a radio signal, it passes through here. It causes these particles to clump together, which completes the circuit, which causes the bell to ring either short or long for a dot or a dash. What you see here is a rod, a wooden rod, a dowel, that as the bell is ringing, it shakes the particles back down to reset this for the next dot or the next dash. So it's a very slow way of sending Morse code, but nonetheless, that's what they had initially. So this actually works, and we also built a spark transmitter using, I think, a flyback transformer like you would use in a TV set to get high voltage. And we take it out sometimes to show teachers how you can make radio waves. And we set up the coherer receiver and the spark transmitter a couple feet apart. And they're just amazed that when we hit the telegraph key over here, it causes the bell to ring over here with no wires in between. So you think they would not find that fascinating, but people still do. Okay, this is one more photo out of that album that we talked about, the early radio stations. This is homebrew from a guy who lived here in Asheville. If you ever come here downtown on a little town square called Pritchard Park, there's a building called the Miles Building. And so this was donated by Mr. Miles, who built that building. As best I can tell, he was experimenting with different means of tuning. So I believe over here, he has a typical coil and capacitor. And then over here, he has this other type of induction coil for selecting the frequency. Has anybody ever seen one of these before? You got knobs on top, and you can bring the coils closer together or further apart, and that's how you would change the frequency that you're listening to.
Isn't that similar to a variometer?
Yes. Yeah, variometer has a coil within a coil, whereas in this setup, the coils are side by side, but same concept. You're changing the inductive value. We actually have a 1920s Montgomery Ward catalog on display, and it's interesting. It only has about 4 or 5 or 6 pages of radios that they sell, but it's got dozens of pages of all the parts that they sell. So this part, I believe, was manufactured by, if I recall, Lee DeForest, and it's actually shown in that early 1920s Montgomery Ward catalog. Anybody ever hear of Atwater Kent? He's pretty well known. No takers?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. Dave, do you know how he got his start?
No.
Okay. There's we've got an interesting biography book on Atwater Kent in the museum. His father, when he was young, his father had a machine shop, and he gave his son Atwater a little room in the back to putter around. And so Atwater used to make little electric dust fans and so forth and sell them. And he made enough money to buy himself a car. And cars back then had 1-cylinder, 2-cylinder, 3-cylinder, 4-cylinder engines, but they all had the same problem. They didn't have a good hot spark with the correct timing depending on the speed of the engine. So Atwater Kent invented and patented the type of ignition system that all of us guys remember from the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, with the rotor and the cap and advanced retard and so forth. Atwater Kent invented that, and he patented it. So you can see the patent dates on this thing. I think this is the ignition coil. This is from 1904 to 1912. So he made a whole lot of money selling these things to Ford and other car manufacturers. And then in the early 1920s, when radio broadcasting became popular, he decided to go into the radio business just as a moneymaker. So I think the first year he made 1,800 radios. And by the end of the 1920s, he was making and selling more than 1 million radios a year. I believe he had somewhere between 12 and 15,000 people working for him making radios.
Okay, I don't know if you've seen it, but there is a YouTube video, I believe, that focuses on Atwater Kent, and begins with the machine shop and the auto ignition. If you'll look for it, you can find it. I saw it recently and viewed.
I appreciate you telling me about that. I have not seen it. I'd like to look for it, and I'll put a link to it on our website as well. Okay, I realize I'm maybe running long, so I may go through these a little bit more quickly. Early police radio. This is what a police radio looked like back in the 1930s. So you can see the flanges for mounting it in the trunk of the car. It's hard to imagine police when they had to use the wall boxes or whatever and didn't have good two-way communications from their car. But this is how things started. Anybody ever see one of these? It's called the Philco Mystery Remote. It came out in 1939, and it was the first wireless remote control for home use. Philco made console radios, and they had a separate little receiver in them. And this is actually a battery-operated transmitter that you could carry around. So you could change the station, you could raise and lower the volume by dialing this thing, which I find interesting. Telephones have been out since around 1875 or thereabouts. And so by 1939, most people were familiar with how you dial a phone. And so apparently the Philco engineers decided that they would just make their user interface similar to a telephone. Anybody recognize this thing? World War II life raft radio.
500 kilohertz rescue radio.
Yes, exactly. So if you were a B-17 crew member and you were shot down and you got into your life raft, you would hope to find this thing. It would have a metal tube with it, and in the tube would be a 50-foot length of wire, an empty balloon, and a cylinder of helium. So you blow up the balloon and you attach the wire to the balloon into the back of the radio, and you've got an antenna. You would sit in your life raft. The reason for the shape on the sides is that you'd be holding this thing between your thighs, and you'd be turning the crank on the top to power it and sending out an emergency signal and hoping that you got picked up before the bad guys found you. So this radio during World War II could save your life. This one here could get you killed if you were caught listening to the wrong station.
And actually, the early Gibson girls used sodium chloride and aluminum to generate hydrogen gas for the lift. But that was, much more dangerous than helium.
I didn't know that. Thank you. I do have some paperwork behind this radio in the museum. I got contacted by a guy who said his father or his friend actually helped design the circuitry for this thing. So it was nice to receive that. Anybody recognize this one? World War II Nazi propaganda radio. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for Hitler, ordered that an inexpensive radio be designed and built so even poor people could have a radio in their house to hear his propaganda programs and Hitler's speeches. And it came with a, it came with a tag on the front. You'll see the tag at the museum if you come. The tag is in German. It was attached to one of the front dials. And it says Denke daran, which means think about this. And it goes on to say that listening to a foreign broadcast station is considered a crime against Germany. And it's a Hitler order that you don't. And if you're caught doing it, you could be put to hard labor in prison, and later in the war you could be put to death if they caught you. So the German authorities put out the word that they had a sniffer where they could drive around in your neighborhood and determine if you were listening to a radio, and if so, they could tell what radio station you could listen to and whether it was German or whether it was the BBC or Voice of America. So do you think that is true, or were they just trying to scare people?
I think they're trying to scare people.
Well, you can monitor the local oscillator if it's not very well shielded.
That's exactly right. And so the answer is yes and no. If you had a super heterodyne radio, then theoretically they could do it if the local oscillator were not shielded. This radio, which is an inexpensive radio, is not super het, and therefore it doesn't have a local oscillator, and so they would not be able to pick you up. But that's been argued back and forth. It's an interesting argument. Okay, this is the Atwater Kent radio that was built on a breadboard. Again, Atwater Kent was so proud of his components that he thought people would want to see them. And so he was wrong for two reasons. The first one being that radios were very expensive back there. They could run you $1,000 or more in today's money. And so people who were going to put out a lot of money wanted something attractive they could put in their living room to impress the neighbors, whereas this looked like a science experiment. And the other reason is that many people were not very familiar with electricity yet. There were still lots of residences, especially in rural areas, that did not have wired electric power. And so people were afraid of getting electrocuted with all these exposed contacts. So this radio was made in 1924, and it was the last radio that Atwater made without a cabinet. In 1925, they had cabinets on. Sidebar question.
I think he was right. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I restored that, so I appreciate your kind words. It did not look like that when it came in. When it came in, it had been sitting down in the basement for about 40 years, and there's some rust on it, but it was basically restorable. So the dials, if anybody's interested, the dials were refinished using a product from Granger Supply called a paint stick. It's like a lacquer crayon. So the first thing you do is pop out all the old paint, and then you run over this thing with the lacquer crayon and paint the whole thing white. Then you rub it off, and the paint just remains in the embossed areas. The cases, or the metal cases on the variable capacitors, were refinished with a texture because the original Atwater Kents had a texture to their paint. It's difficult or impossible to duplicate the exact texture, but this is as close as I could come. And you do it with a paint that comes from an automobile parts store. It's called Very High Temperature Paint, and they sell a version that produces a crinkle pattern. The refinishing the brass, these brass sockets are held onto the Bakelite bases with very brittle, very tiny tabs, and if you attempt to bend them to take the brass socket off, you're going to break the tab or break it when you try and put it back on. So I had to invent a way of polishing the sockets in place because they were very badly corroded. And I'll spare you the story of how I did that. But if anybody ever needs to know, you can contact me. Sidebar question, because it sounds like some of you guys know the answer. Why do these vacuum tubes have a mirror finish?
I have no idea.
Well, in the early days, the vacuum equipment was not strong enough to pull as good a vacuum as they really wanted to achieve. And so what they started doing was putting a piece of, I want to call it chromium, cadmium, I think it is, one or the other. I'm sorry, I'm confused, but it's a little piece of metal they put inside the tube before they seal the tube. And then after they sealed it, they put an electric coil around it. It was magnesium. That's what it was. They put an electric coil around it, and it would cause the magnesium to explode. And in doing so, it would use up all the remaining oxygen molecules inside the tube. And then the exploded magnesium would coat the inside of the tube with the mirror finish.
Huh.
And so the magnesium was called the getter, Getter, because it was getting rid of all or most of the remaining oxygen molecules inside the tube.
I've got a theory if you would entertain it.
I will.
A mirror finish on the vacuum tubes might improve the efficiency by reflecting electrons back into the cathode.
Makes sense to me. The research I've done on it, I've never seen anybody postulate that or say that was the reason, but it certainly seems plausible. Has anybody ever heard of station KDKA?
Yes.
Of course.
Mhm.
I think most of us have. That was the first commercial broadcasting station that started in 1920, actually. And it came about because there was an amateur radio operator, an engineer working for Westinghouse. And after World War I, Westinghouse received a contract to try and improve military radio equipment. So the engineer working on that would take his radio transmitter to his shack in his garage on the weekends, and to have something to do, he had broadcast music. And so people stumbled upon his broadcast, and he began to get contacts from people saying, would you please play more music? So he goes to work, and one of the businessmen managers walks into his office, and he explains what's going on. And that manager says, aha, if there's more content out there for people to hear, we could probably sell more radios. And so he convinces Westinghouse's management to start a commercial broadcasting station, and that station was KDKA. So we're very excited about is the radio you're looking at actually came out of a closet at station KDKA in Pittsburgh. There's a fellow who was working there, I think in the 1960s, and they were cleaning out a closet there, and whoever cleaned out the closet found this radio and offered it to him. And he took it, and he later retired in Asheville. And when he heard about our museum, he donated it. So it's another thing that we're very happy to have. I'll skip through these fairly quickly. We talked about variometers a second ago. There's one here on display here. This is actually a regenerative radio, and so this, keep losing my mouse here. This knob here causes this, it's called a tickler coil, to go more in or more out, and that's how you control the amount of regeneration. This is a radio, again, that we're very happy to have. A family brought in this radio on a hand truck, and it was literally falling apart. The case was broken. All this was missing. The audio transformers were missing. You see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of these RF coils in here. One of these, the case would come open, and there's about 1,000 feet of fine wire sitting here in a pile. And this was Granddad's radio. And So we said we take it in, and I was thinking at first that this is just going to be a parts radio, but I took a picture of it and put it out on the Antique Radio Forum and said, can anybody identify this thing? And sure enough, some people could. It is a very early superhet radio. Edwin Armstrong, the guy who invented the regenerative circuit, also invented superheterodyne, and he patented it, I believe, in 1918. So this is an early mid 1920s superheterodyne radio with 8 tubes. Now you'll notice that unlike a modern superhet radio, it has 2 tuning dials, not just one. And the reason for that is that this radio was made before the mixer tube was invented, that's used in more modern superhet radios where you're combining the 2 signals to heterodyne them. So this is how you're tuning in the station. This is how you're tuning the local oscillator. But if you come to the museum, I think you'll enjoy seeing this thing. It's a beautiful radio, and it's been fully restored. It's working. Another nice radio. The original tuned radio, TRF radios, like that breadboard radio, you actually had to tune each of the RF circuits individually, unlike the super heterodyne radio. So you'd have three tuning knobs on them, and you had to go back and forth trying to tune in a station. So this is a later version. People complained about having to do that. So this company, Daythan, came up with the idea of having a main tuning dial here with slave belts going to this variable capacitor and this variable capacitor. So as you're tuning this, you're actually tuning all 3 of the variable capacitors. But also with this control and this control, these are little veneer controls where you could fine tune these 2 capacitors after they were mostly tuned. We have scanners, we have citizens band. This is an interesting little radio from the early 1950s. Have you seen this is a miniature vacuum tube, and these are called sub-miniature vacuum tubes. Have you guys ever seen these things?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know how they came to be invented? In World War II, the Allies wanted to invent a proximity detector that was small enough to fit in the head of an artillery shell, so they could shoot an artillery shell towards a German buzz bomb, and if it got close enough, the prox detector would set off the explosion from the artillery shell and hopefully destroy the buzz bomb while it's still in the air. So the miniature tubes that we're familiar with were too big to do that. So the sub-miniature tubes were invented and served that purpose. And then in the early 1950s, they were also used in this radio as well as hearing aids.
Did that proximity idea actually work?
It's a great question. I think it did, but I haven't really researched it that fully.
And you would think just launching the shell, the G forces would be enough to break everything in there.
I hear your point. I don't know, but I'll try and see what I can find out later.
Okay, and actually that was another reason the tubes had to be miniaturized, because it reduced, the momentum of the elements. And I recently found an article on that. And if you'll give Rob your email address, I'll try to locate that link and send it to you.
I would really appreciate that, Arnold. And Rob has my email address already, so I look forward to receiving that. If you happen to stumble upon that YouTube link on Atwater Kent, you can include that as well.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm originally from New Orleans. Any of you know the word lagniappe? Lagniappe in New Orleans means a little bit extra. So if you come to the Radio Museum, this is the lagniappe. It's a little bit extra. This is a 1946 Rockola jukebox that we have recently restored, and it's in full playing condition. We have it out in the lobby of the 3rd floor where we're located, so students and faculty can enjoy it. It was actually donated by the family that donated this radio. They came back sometime after doing the donation, and we showed them how we had restored it. And then we actually have videos, I believe, on YouTube showing it in operation, and they were just thrilled. They could not believe we were able to do that. And so the son-in-law who was there pulled me aside. And he says, Grandma has this 1946 jukebox that she's been hauling around the country for decades. And if you play your cards right, maybe you can get it. So we played our cards right and we got it. So this has been a labor of love, restoring this. I actually restored in my personal collection a 1946 Wurlitzer 1015 jukebox, which is the one that's in the Smithsonian with the bubbles and lights and so forth, and had it for many years down in New Orleans. And Hurricane Katrina got it, just totally
Oh
destroyed it.
no.
But so I was glad to get my hands on another jukebox to restore. Okay,
I'll give you-
I'm running
I'll give
over,
you
so I'm
an
going to go really quickly through this.
I'll give you an aside to the jukebox thing. I had a client about 20 years ago down in Fayetteville, Georgia, who was a dentist.
Uh-huh.
And in talking to him, I found out he had an interest in jukeboxes. He opened the door. We went down the steps into his basement, and he had probably 10 jukeboxes down there, which, as a dentist, he had the hands, I guess you would say, to restore. He had 10 working jukeboxes down there in his basement. I do not know what happened. I know he eventually moved to Florida. I do not know what happened to all the jukeboxes, but that was incredible to walk down the steps, turn the corner into his basement, and see 10 jukeboxes running down there.
It's got to be incredible. What an experience. Back on Katrina, the problem was that a lot of people had their collections in their basements, and the basements are what flooded. So anyway, even the hospitals had their emergency power generators in the basements, and their basements flooded. So live and learn. Okay, moving on. Very quick. Sorry?
Oh. When you restored that, how did you restore the records that are in there? Were they had to be all screwed up?
Great question. This jukebox played 78 records, 78 RPM records. And believe it or not, those records are still readily available. But in this jukebox, the people that own the jukebox that donated it had bought a set of reproduction 1940s 78 records. They were reproduced by a company called Victory Glass that is still in operation today. I used them back in 1985 when I did that Wurlitzer. But working on these things is I'm running over, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but the mechanisms inside are fascinating, for like the coin mechanism, where if you put a coin in, it does a test to see, did you put in a coin or did you put in an iron slug? Because there's a magnet in there that'll catch the iron slug. And if you put in a washer, there's a spring-loaded metal finger that will stick the finger in the middle of the washer and catch it before it goes down. But all kinds of very, very interesting mechanical stuff.
That's
Sorry?
cool.
Yeah. Kids like to spell their names in Morse code, so we've got the chart and Morse code practice oscillators. I think I mentioned the MP3 players, so we let people do that. Books. These are two books that I think you may find interesting. A lot of people photograph these covers; they'll remember them. The book on the left is by Eric Larson, and it's about the story of Marconi and how he came to figure out that he could make radio waves useful and everything that he did along the way to become a success. It's very, very well written, and it's very historically accurate. The book on the right is from a museum in Bellingham, Washington called the Spark Museum. It was started by a gazillionaire Silicon Valley guy who decided he'd create the biggest and best collection of all things electrical and electronic from the early days. You can buy this book. It's a hardcover book on Amazon. You can usually pick up a copy for around $15, and it's a wonderful thing to have on your bookshelf. That's just an example of some of the stuff that he has in there, the quality of the illustrations. Talked about the catalogs. That's that Montgomery Ward catalog where the Lee DeForest tuning mechanism was. Everybody knows who Ken Burns is. Have any of you seen his documentary on radio called Empire of the Air?
Oh yeah, that's excellent.
Okay, good. Talks about Edwin Armstrong, Lee DeForest, and Sarnoff, David Sarnoff. And so if you subscribe to PBS, I think you can get it on demand. If not, you can pick it up on eBay for $10 or $15, but no nice thing to have. I'll skip that. So if you visit us in Asheville, As mentioned, you can make a special appointment if you're coming up with a group. We've got highly detailed directions for finding us on our website, or if you send me an email, I'll reply with detailed directions. So that's the direction page on our website. It includes a picture by picture of how to get there. And if you click on that, the QR code, it'll bring up a map showing where you are and where we are and how to get there. If you need to contact me, there's a contact us form at the bottom of our page. If you have anything you'd like to contribute to the collection, we'd be delighted to consider it. You can see how full the museum is, and so we're kind of at the point where we can only add things on display that are really special for one reason or another. If you have something else that can be contributed, quite honestly, what we do is take those to Hamfests and sell it to raise money to operate the museum. It's a nonprofit museum. Everybody who works there is volunteers. We don't get paid. We don't go out and do lunch. All the money goes into the museum. So if you're comfortable donating for that reason, please do. If you're not, please don't. We'd still have you.
We have your contact information. I'd like to see if I can put together maybe an outing for our club to go up there on a Saturday and just hit the museum. And if I could get 3 or 4 people to ride with me, maybe we can work something out. The closing, your operation is not through December, January. I assume that's because school is out, or you just want to take the holidays off?
It's primarily because we just don't get that many out of town visitors during December and January.
Okay.
But like I say, if there are tourists in town or anybody else, and they contact me on this form and say, we're in town, we're not there on a Saturday, we see you're closed, 9 times out of 10, we open up the museum for people.
All right.
I just live 10 minutes away, so it's no big deal for me.
I'd like to see if I can stir up maybe 2 or 3 people to go up there, and maybe we can take 2 carloads. We might be able to fill your museum up one Saturday.
Okay. I'm closing out because I know we're out of time. The last thing I wanted to mention, and the timing I know is awful. It's probably won't help you at all. But this Saturday is when we have our annual vintage radio flea market. So this is the 3rd year we're doing it. We stopped during COVID, but it's really starting to build a lot of interest from people that are within close enough driving distance. So probably not good for you this year, but maybe something to keep in mind for next year.
Certainly would be.
So
could you go back to that slide,
that
please, real quick? I want to try to catch an image of it.
Question: Are there any like Holy Grail radios?
Awesome, thank you.
That you would really like to get a hold of for the museum?
You know, that's probably a better question for Ron Beaver. Ron is like I say, he's the guy who's been a ham for decades. I was a ham back in my younger days. I'm not that active right now, but I can certainly ask Ron that question and send that information to Rob. The one thing that I don't have that I would like to have one of these days is a rotary spark, because we've got the spark generator, but we don't have a rotary spark. We have lots of vibroplexes and other such things, but not a rotary spark.
Have you heard of there's a local ham. He's not in our club. He's in another club. He's in the North Fulton Amateur Radio League. He built from scratch a spark gap radio, and he built all the components. It's quite or most of the components. It's quite beautiful, and makes a very nice sound. And he calls it Blue Lightning, and he's actually issued some postcards with pictures of it operating. And he used to bring it around to local clubs and let the members operate it with a Morse code key. And he had to be, he has to be careful with it because they're quite illegal. So he makes sure that it's toned down, but that would be a wonderful addition. I don't know what he's done with it. I haven't seen it in years. But
the Blue Lightning, you can call it Blue Lightning.
Well,
Yeah.
If
There you
any of you guys have his call sign or contact information, Rob, if you can email that to me, I'll try and make contact,
I'll do it.
see what it says.
I'll do it.
So
You know, one thing to add about Leda Forest, you're mentioning Leda Forest, it just the Atlanta Radio Club. I guess we were started in what, 1911, somewhere around there. So we've been around for a long time, and over the years we've been given honorary memberships to people who we think qualify for it. Important. We can see in our records book that a certificate was sent to him, to Leda Forest, making him an honorary member of the Atlanta Radio Club.
that's great. No, I had no idea the club was that old.
The second oldest club in Georgia after Georgia Tech.
Yeah, we got shut down for a couple of years during the First World War for some reason. When it came back, I believe it was 1921.
Yeah.
We actually got a certificate signed by Maxim himself, his own signature, bringing us back into the ARRL, and I believe it's dated 1921.
As I understand it, during World War I, all amateur radio communication was shut down.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
They
But
they had proven just before the war, the Navy was trying to use VHF, and once you went over the horizon, it went away. And the amateur people proved that, yeah, we can take these scrap junk bands, they called them, the low ones, and go all the way to Europe. And of course, the Navy's response was to build bigger transmitters on VHF and outlaw the competition. So that's what they did. Typical government response.
Yeah, well, I understand there's a very strong amateur radio response at the beginning of World War I, that they were woefully short of people who knew how to operate radio equipment. So they put out the calls of the amateur radio operators and had a couple of thousand of them sign up.
Yep, especially up the East Coast.
Yep.
Stuart, yeah, if you're looking for demonstrations of the value of radio in general, there's one going on now where the stock traders are trying to get frequencies assigned from the ham band, well, next to the ham bands, where they can broadcast their stock trades into New York from Chicago, wherever they are, because they said that radio waves go at the speed of light, but the data going through fiber only goes at 70% of the speed of light. So they want to beat it with the radio waves, and then they're trying to. The big thing with the FCC, AWL is fighting it because they want to broadcast 20 kilowatts next to our bands.
That is very interesting. I do remember reading probably years ago about going to fiber was considered such a great advantage at the time.
At the time,
because milliseconds made all the difference between making money and losing money. So I can understand they're still trying to push the envelope.
Yeah, we've got in the Atlanta area, they put fiber in everywhere. I was in the heavy part of the telecom industry back then, and the rumor was that we had up to 40 times the capacity that Atlanta needed for future growth. I mean, they were shoving 3 bundles as thick as your arm in everywhere they could downtown. And then, after 9/11, everything kind of ground to a stop. And we go down and get a fiber line into our facility, and they give us 3 more just for the hell of it. Just because you use it or lose it, it's not being used. So we were actually, the usage we were putting into them, which was just a minuscule amount of what it could handle, was mainly so if there was a break somewhere, we would report the outage. That's what they were doing. They had so much in the ground, we couldn't use it, but they had to have something in there so they knew if it broke.
Well, speaking of things breaking, I'm curious as to whether any of you guys have ever seen that show. It's on cable TV. I forget whether it's the History Channel or Discovery, one of them. But it was an hour-long show on the laying of the first transatlantic cable, undersea cable. Has anybody seen that?
I've seen documentaries about that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I have too. It was in Wired magazine about 10 years ago. They were talking about the problems they had with it.
Well, what puzzles me, they were talking about how this first one was constructed. And if I remember right, you had a number of cables of wires inside that were wrapped around each other to carry the signal. Then around that, you had a layer of insulation. I think they used gutta percha or something like it. And then around that, I think you had heavier duty wire around the outside, and then maybe some sort of insulation around that. But what I'm wondering is how they would splice that. because according to this story, the first time they tried to lay the cable, they had all the cable on one boat, and they got out in the middle of the Atlantic, and the equipment snagged or jammed or whatever, and it broke the cable, and they were not able to recover it. So they had to make a second cable, and this time they made it in two halves. So one half was on a ship that launched from North America, and the other half was on a ship that launched from England, and they had to meet out in the middle of the Atlantic and then splice the cable together. And I'm just having a hard time. Say again?
The golden splice. That's what they could call it.
Yeah. I do remember one of the issues was once they finally got it laid, it went from what, somewhere in New York over to, we'll say somewhere just outside of London. The stations are still there where you can see it. But one of the issues that they had was when they started getting faster and faster, sending traffic through it, they hit a limit because the wires would interact and induce currents in each other. And by the time it got to the other end, it was a muddied mess.
Yes.
So they end up going much lower speed CW than they meant to spend.
That's what I saw in this in the story as well. Is I think when they first started, the speed was somewhat reasonable, but things rapidly degenerated to the point where it was barely useful, and you couldn't charge the kind of prices they had to charge to pay for this thing. So they ended up having a new engineer design a third cable. And by the time they designed the third cable to solve the problem of speed that you just mentioned, there's a bigger ship that had been built and was available. So they were able to put the entire bigger cable on that one ship and bring it across the ocean. So
yeah,
fascinating stuff.
Wired magazine had a thing in there. It's been some time ago. They talked about the trials and tribulations of doing that, and they finally got it to work and realized, well, this is not the panacea we thought it was going to be. And then other things came in, and by the time they really solved the technical issues around it, they had radio that was reliable. And the second thing they mentioned in the article was that Marconi sat there. I think he was in Nova Scotia, and he was listening to Ireland. I think is the way it worked. And they've proved now with the knowledge that we have with solar cycles and whatnot that he could not possibly have heard Ireland. It was a marketing gimmick. So
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well,
if you say something loud enough and say it often enough, it becomes truth.
Well, it's a political strategy today as well. But the other story about Marconi and saying it loud and proud was he claimed he had invented the circuitry that allowed you to tune a transmitter to a particular frequency. And of course that was very important because if you cannot tune the signal, then you can only have one telegraph operator operating at once. Otherwise they'll be stepping all over each other.
Yeah.
So Marconi claimed that he developed that circuit when in fact he had stolen it from Nikola Tesla. And so Nikola Tesla also applied for the patent, but because Marconi was the rock star, the patent office awarded the patent to Marconi. And then some number of years or decades later, the patent office reversed itself and rightfully gave it to Tesla.
Yeah, there was a lot of competition amongst those guys. I will see if I can work out some way to put together a crew to come up and visit the museum and maybe do something else in the Asheville area while we're up there. Rob has your contact information, so I'll see what I can do by getting a hold of you. If we can arrange something, I would appreciate it. I really would, and the club would too.
Be glad to host you, and I love being tour guide here in Asheville. So if you need any other thoughts on what to see and do, there's plenty around here.
Well, something radio related would be nice, but after a 3-hour drive up there, I wouldn't be too particular. The museum itself would be enough for me.
Well, there's I don't know if anybody's been there, but there's a old resort hotel here called the Grove Park Inn. It was built in 1912, and it is a spectacular building to see. And next to that is the Antique Car Museum. It's actually on the same grounds.
Yeah.
And next to the Car Museum, you've got the Homespun Museum, which is another interesting museum, also both free. And
I used to live about a mile from Grove Park, and my girlfriend and I would actually get up on Sunday morning and walk out there and have brunch. And
yep.
And of course, they've built a lot onto it since then. They were building the new addition, and I think the car museum has come along since then. But we used to go to the cafeteria. One of the things, guys, if you've never been to the Grove Park, it's the only really good hotel in the whole area. And every celebrity that comes through to do anything in the area stays at the Grove Park. So every room has a plaque on the outside to tell you which famous people stayed in that room. I always thought that was pretty neat. George Gobel's got like 2 rooms up there.
Well, listen, if you can afford it, there's a new hotel that just opened here in the middle of town. And I checked their room rates, and during the leaf peeping season, you can stay there for $700 a night.
Is that the Indigo right there next to the Civic Center?
No, it's not the Indigo. It's called, I think it's called the Restoration Hotel, because it was this butt ugly building that was right in the middle of downtown Asheville. And somebody bought it and totally redid the whole thing. It is absolutely gorgeous.
I haven't been through downtown Asheville probably in 2 or 3 years. I usually go around when I'm there, but it was always one of my favorite. Of course, now they've gone down to Pack Square and they've turned that into a traffic circle and built 2 big buildings right there on what used to be the pub. I mean, downtown is so congested at this point. I just avoid it when I come through there. I hate to say that, but I do.
Well, I live, it's about 7 minutes down the mountain for me. I live above the Grove Park Inn, so that's a short drive. And
You're on up on Bowcatcher Mountain back in there.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place.
It
Nice
is.
drive too, if you get up there when the leaves are gone. All right, we got some club business to touch on too, so I appreciate the presentation, and we would applaud, but I don't think that carries well on Zoom. So,
No.
but we do appreciate the presentation. It was a good one, and I know my part is I would like to grab a couple guys and run up there and see the museum at your convenience.
Well, that's fine. And I'll just say you've been one of the best clubs I've presented to, because it's you feel really lonely when you're just up here talking and nobody's saying anything back to you. So I really appreciate all the interaction. Thanks, guys.
We were trying hard not to walk on you. Thanks for the presentation. All right.
Okay,
Thanks, Stuart.
All right.
good night.
Good night.
Stuart.
Oh, is he gone yet? We can talk about him now.
Yeah.
All right. We'll make this real quick. I don't want to drag it out. In Zoom meetings, we can sit here till midnight, but I think 2 hours is probably enough. Representing the executive board, the new guys that were elected in August, I don't think any of us actually knew. We've all been around, so everybody knows us. We've sort of come up with an idea of some things we want to work on, and I've made notes during the meetings, and I really meant to have them organized enough to publish. I'll get them out sometime this week. My work has been crazy, and I can kind of see it coming to an end, but it's consumed more time than I wanted it to. 2 of the issues that came up that we talked about, the issues, 2 of the ideas that came up. One of them was restarting the second Sunday technical sessions, and I had that in the back of my head as something we'd like to do, and I think everybody but one of the 5 of us, 6 of us that were there, everybody but one mentioned it. So is that something that, well, we don't really have enough folks in here to get the question. I can get it started and put the effort into it like I did the first time, but I'm going to need some help. The last time we did this, I had to stop because my mom got sick, and I found that there was absolutely nobody in the club that was willing to go up and open the room and say, here's our presenter for the day. I would like to have some backup if we're going to start this thing. So when the idea comes up, if anybody would like to volunteer to help me with it, I would appreciate it.
Hey, Bill, can you just explain what they are, the Sunday sessions are?
Yeah, the second Sunday technical session, it was an idea that Jim Farmer, who was the president way back when I was, I think, secretary or something, wanted some educational thing, and we came up with the idea that if you want to go sit in a meeting like we just did and watch a presentation, you can watch a presentation. My idea was to have something more hands-on, where the technical session is we are going to do something. We're going to build a kit. We're going to build an antenna. It would be maybe a very short presentation on what we're going to do, and then we start constructing. Some of the other clubs have stepped up since they've stopped and sort of taken that over or filled in some of those spots. I know there's technical nets and things on 2 meters, but I don't think anybody's actually doing what we were, which is every month build something. Kits, fox hunts. Arnold did a real good presentation once on the fox hunt receiver, And his start out was about 30 minutes explaining how the circuit worked, and we started building them. And it was a lot of fun. We had a good response to it. But when the idea comes out, I would like for at least one person to be my backup, so that if something happens job related or health related, it won't just fall in the dirt like it did last time. So that's one thing. John had restarted the idea of doing something on the second Sunday of the month, which has turned into park outings, which, by the way, we've got coming up this Sunday. We might want to move that, John, to, if you want to continue doing it, move it to maybe the first Sunday or the third Sunday and kind of get away from the second. That's something we can talk about later. What was the other idea that came up? Do you remember, Ed? Is Ed still here?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the idea you had that I thought was so good? I wasn't going to bring it up, but you did.
Was it build antennas and sell them to make money for the club?
That was one of them. Yeah, that's again, that would be something I'd be willing to tackle that, but we need some people willing to step up and kind of help with
Let
things
me
like that.
get my notes from that meeting. I
No,
mean,
that's good enough. We'll actually publish the thing and get more comments, because if you look at the group here, there's only like 2 or 3 people on this meeting that were not at the table the night we were talking. So you know, when your audience is this small, everybody kind of remembers. In any event, that's the only thing. Ed, how are we doing on the bank accounts and so forth? You and Aid were working on that.
well, we're kind of on hold right now. We need to all meet at the bank.
Okay.
I think correct me if I'm wrong. There's a little over 12,000 in the banks in the accounts.
Aid's muted.
All right, whoops, I had to unmute. That's right, 12 or 14, somewhere in that neighborhood.
No, what I do need to do, and I'll try and get it done this weekend, I need to log into all those accounts and make sure I have access to them and I can see the balance.
Yep.
And print out a statement if I can do that.
Aid is a good custodian and he's a good club member and he's been around for a while. So, you know, it's not like we're desperately trying to wrestle the accounts away from him, but we need to follow the bylaws. And you two just decide when it's convenient, when you can do it. I can make my schedule fit whatever time you want to do it.
Well,
Okay.
Aid, can we talk this weekend sometime and maybe next week if everybody's available, maybe towards the end of next week?
That's fine with me.
That would be, yeah, but yeah, anytime I'm available.
Okay, John, you okay with that? Could we make it work? Oh, he's giving us a big thumbs up. He's not talking tonight, so okay. So we had an adventure this weekend on the mountain in Tennessee, and I think John probably had talked more than he's talked in years up there.
Oh, tell us about that.
We got locked in on top of went up to Buck Ball to do a Tennessee QSO party at midnight, went to leave, and the gate was locked. And we're not sure if it was locked on purpose or by accident. So John and I went back up on the mountain and said, we'll just call in the morning. And we went, took a nap and slept up there. And 7 o'clock, I figured it'd be unlocked. No, it's still locked. So now we're calling the sheriff's department and the forest rangers, everybody else. And it was 2:30 in the afternoon before we got out. So as panicked as some people got, honest to God, it was the best afternoon I have spent in a long time. We just put our chairs up, we looked out over the fog, we listened to the guys play cards. It was a hoot. So I don't want to do it again, but it wasn't bad.
John still made the net Sunday night. So where were you for the net? Were you on top of the mountain?
Yeah, well, he had the Echo Link. I was actually working 20-meter contest. You guys haven't seen me do this because you don't come out with me when I'm by myself. But when I get heads down on something like a QSO party, I mean, it would take a shotgun blast to stir me out of it, or it would take Chris walking over with his girlfriend and talking. Either one of those have about the same effect.
Internet wasn't real reliable up there. I checked in and I got about 2 or 3 check-ins in the net and it died. So I lost all connection.
So I wasn't too worried about the Tennessee QSO party because Alabama's coming up Saturday, and that's the one where I haven't invited anybody. I haven't even told anybody where I'm going. So I'll just show up there, and it's a 12-hour. So by Sunday in the park, I'll be dragging, but I'll be moving, hopefully, unless they put the gate down while I'm over at the park. All right, that's all.
Should bring some bolt cutters.
No, grinder.
I've already told I've already told John what I'm going to do is I've got two padlocks. I just bought them this week. I got one that's a regular size padlock and one that's twice that size. So when we go up there next year, if there's not a padlock in there, I'll put my padlock in it. And if there is one, then I'll put my padlock over it and block the keyhole. We won't get locked to hell up there
I
again.
bet you by the time we go up to that thing, it'll still be sitting there cut off like it was. They probably won't even fix it. We found the bolt cutters don't work because you can't get them in the hole to where the lock was. So the guy had to bring a grinder out and finish grinding
Holy
up
cow,
the
really?
strut.
It was fun to watch though. That those two young ladies that showed up, one of them looked like she was in a very spiffy, clean uniform, Forest Service, real professional. And the other's wearing like blue jeans and a black T-shirt. And I know if I was going to get in a fight, which one I wouldn't want to fight with, because that little dark-haired girl, boy, she was swinging that reciprocal saw around, and she looked dangerous out there. That thing. Anyway, it was fun.
They're
All
my
right, that's
my
it. I'm not going to keep you all night. It's a good meeting, and if you guys are interested in riding up there some Saturday, let me know. I can pack 3 people in my car, and we can take 2 cars, and maybe I don't know, see the museum, and then do something else in Asheville. So let's float that as an idea, if y'all
Yeah.
interested.
Do that.
All right, that's it.
We can go to Linsville. We can go to Lynn's in Candler, and her backyard's so big we could put a 160 up. Have lots of room.
Well, Candler's only maybe 25, 30, maybe 26, 20, maybe 30 miles from, I'm trying to count in my head the roads, probably 30 miles from where I mean, he's right there coming in on I-26. So he's not too far off the I-40. I know exactly where AB Tech is at. Oh yeah, we got a picture on the other thing here. So yeah, you go by it right on 26. All right, guys, that's it. Good meeting next month. Cool.